Chapter 1: Your Mother's Tears. If I have learned anything in my life, it is that the only way to get to where you want to go is to know where you came from. Quincy Jones. How much do you know about the pain your mother carries? I invite you to reflect on this question for a moment. There's something really special about asking questions, as it can lead you down a rabbit hole toward truths that completely alter your perspective about life and the reality you've created. Life changed for me the day I asked my mother about her tears. An inquisitive child, I wanted badly to understand her emotions. Now, as an adult, focusing inward, I've become determined to turn that childlike curiosity toward myself and understand the triggers behind my tears and the generational sorrows that may influence them. When my mother cries, I see the tears of my ancestors forming a river that flows through time. I feel centuries of pain that turn my mother's expressed emotions into an act that carries more weight than the present moment. In turn, it becomes a spiritual experience marked by the blood, sweat, tears, and energy of those who paved our way. And I don't even think she's aware of it. Our mothers are the maps we need to find our way home. Home to the messages and gems of freedom that were ingrained deep in the hearts of our ancestors for us to find. Getting to the root of who I am, as well as who my mother is, started with turning to her for answers and accepting that some of my personal challenges not only stemmed from her, but from my genetics and intergenerational trauma. It has been a heavy burden to bear, the thought that we carry a pain we didn't ask for. And acceptance has made all the difference, eventually bringing on a sense of relief. I know that when I choose joy, it isn't just a conscious decision, but something I've worked toward. How we respond to pain impacts more than just ourselves. Embracing that, in some way we all carry intergenerational trauma, has helped me not only live well, but forgive my mother for her shortcomings. This renewed outlook has allowed me to understand that she is the product of many influences, some of which she may never have the capacity, resources, or words to fully grasp. Intergenerational trauma, also known as transgenerational trauma, is an emotional or psychological trauma experienced by a group of people that affects the health and well-being of individuals in successive generations. While it manifests differently in everyone, impacted generations will often show signs and symptoms like depersonalization, emotional numbness, depression, and anxiety, blemished life skills, a lack of self-worth, and post-traumatic stress. This is one of the many reasons I aim to not only heal myself, but my entire bloodline, to repair the past, the present, and even the future. And now I'd like to share a quote, and the source is unknown. Some people cannot be cured, but everyone can heal. My journey toward uncovering my family history began with a simple conversation. While direct and intimate communication with my loved ones has always been afforded to me throughout my life, I admit that I do not come from a family that often talks about healing modalities, mental health, or coping techniques in particular. We never held space to share our wellness tips or address our childhood traumas. So as an adult, it's taken discomfort and a lot of bravery to break that cycle. Using my approach to the Precious Dreams Foundation as inspiration, I've centered my nonprofit's mission on the very themes that champion the cause of wellness each day. And while it took me some time, I'm finally at a place where I'm ready to bring that mission home. To create lasting change, one that would have a ripple effect on future generations, I decided to speak to the woman God used as a vessel to bring me into this world. The woman responsible for my life, From a young age, I've always felt that I've represented the fullest realization of my mother's bravest intentions. I was empowered to be the better version of her, and that was the legacy she aimed to leave in raising me. Through her prideful eyes, I've always felt as though I had the ability to articulate the thoughts she would often shy away from speaking. One Sunday afternoon, I called my mother and asked if she could answer some questions for me. Wasting no time, I asked, "Ma, do you think one of your parents had a mental disorder?" Her contemplative response, "That's a good question," was followed by a long pause. It soon became evident that while she didn't have an exact answer, she held certain suspicions. My mother had never thought to ask her own parents such a personal question. This realization struck me deeply and highlighted the contrast between my mother's openness with me and her reluctance to do the same with her own parents. My mother confided in a pensive tone, "I never asked my parents about mental health. Growing up, my parents just didn't discuss their past. I could see challenges in my dad through different behavioral episodes, but I would just try to calm him down. I wouldn't ask questions. My mother was incredibly stern, so I learned early on not to question or ask too much, especially when she seemed stressed. I wanted to break that communication barrier with my own kids. I wanted you to know that you could come to me about anything. Reflecting on it now, I think she handled her stress through drinking and smoking. She was a chain smoker. So for her, that was how she self-medicated." Angie. My mother, Angie, is the only person in my immediate family who will stay to the end of a difficult conversation to answer all of my toughest questions. Even if she only engages in these type of conversations when I initiate the dialogue, she remains present despite her discomfort. Broadening my understanding of myself required me to educate myself on my mother's history. To do so, I began calling her more frequently to connect. You see, my mother lives in Florida, and I reside in New York, so I only see her once a year. But that doesn't get in the way of our calls. Sundays allow us to spend the most time in conversation together, so we started referring to these talks as Soul Sundays. Through these calls, we engage in a deeper conversation with the understanding that they are a great benefit to both of us. Before embarking on this journey, my knowledge about my maternal grandfather was extremely limited. I knew he was from Spanish Harlem. Everybody called him Pete, and he dropped out of school in second grade. I was told he had a way with words, but ironically, had never learned to read or write. Now, in his 80s and coping with dementia, he brings it up every time there's an awkward moment of silence, ensuring that I know his education journey ended before the age of 7. With a playful, tender grin, he lovingly reminds me, "You know your grandfather can't read, right, baby?" And to that I reply, "Yes, Grandpa, I know." Grandpa Pete never shares more of his story, and likely cannot now with his condition. So that's what we've all taken for fact. However, when my mother was a child, he shared with her that his motivation for abandoning his education was to earn more money to help his single mother put food on the table. Now, he imparts sentiments of sorrow and leaves it for everyone to interpret as they choose. I've always wanted to tell him that it's not too late to learn to read or write. But honestly, up until I started writing this book, I too was guilty of believing that he would never be afforded the opportunity. While writing this book, my Soul Sunday calls with my mother grew to include more frequent conversations where I was able to ask for her assistance in gathering information about her father's childhood, something she never felt encouraged to do before. While my grandfather currently lives in a nursing home, his wife, a vibrant woman in her 90s, is still sharp enough to recall more family history than most of the family in my generation combined. I asked my mother if she could find out what part of Harlem he grew up in and where his mother was born. In a single phone call to her stepmother, she learned more than she ever had about a man she's known her entire life. The first shocker, for me, was the revelation that her father's name wasn't actually Pete. "Your grandfather couldn't learn," my mother said as soon as I answered the phone one Sunday. "The school told him he wasn't capable of learning, and they sent him to a mental institution where he was institutionalized with adults." I could tell she was in complete shock, and everything she shared after that was a blur for me. At that moment, my mind raced to my circle of friends and their healthy, capable children who have been diagnosed with ADHD, ODD, dyslexia, and autism. But then I thought about myself. I was the first in my family to be evaluated for and diagnosed with ADHD. In today's more progressive climate, although there's still a lot of room for improvement, we're able to understand the unique workings of our children's minds on a much deeper level. Yet, a shadow of sadness ultimately grew to become anger as I imagined life in the 1930s, where any child would be sent away because they lacked neurotypical learning abilities. All these years, my grandfather simply never understood that his inability to unlock his full potential was primarily due to systemic barriers and societal limitations that existed around a lack of understanding in psychology and education, especially in Black and Brown communities. As a child, my grandfather was not illiterate because he wasn't smart. His limitations were a direct result of undiagnosed mental health challenges and a learning disability. Through my grandfather's life and his inability to share his truths, I was able to see firsthand how silence can grow to become the weapon that harms not just you, but even those around you. But I can't expect my grandfather to learn or share more if no one extends an invitation to help him understand how much we now know about learning challenges. Through my work with the Precious Dreams Foundation, I have guided tens of thousands of young people through transformative journeys, leading them to spiritual awakenings that reshape their paths, all while my grandfather aged with the belief that he was incapable of healing and learning. My disappointment and my family's silence, and the realization that such simple questions had the power to uncover the truth has led me to understand even more intimately why I need to turn my attention inward and face the challenges that my family carries. They, too, deserve the same compassion and support that I readily offer to the world. My mother and her father can grow from who I've become. My family can benefit from my privileges. Growing up, I saw my mother cry often. In the street, she embodied the quintessential Black Nuyorican spirit, a person of Puerto Rican origin or descent who currently or formerly resides in New York City. She often used her animated voice and Rosie Perez-like annotations to diminish any threat that came her way. If you knew my mom, you knew she was always ready for whatever and would do anything to protect herself or her family. And I mean anything. She couldn't speak a lick of Spanish, but the way she would twist her face to curse out a complete stranger or exaggerately pronounce her R's showed that much of her character was built by her environment. At home, however, it was a very different story. My mother was extremely soft-spoken, and her vulnerable disposition made her appear almost childlike. Her situational fragility manifested itself in different ways, allowing her to show up or shrink, depending on her environment and the level of safety that she felt. When she came home, it was almost as if her guard came down as she undressed. Within the confines of her home, it wasn't uncommon to see my mother express a full range of emotions, never concealing her joys or sorrows. I was both intrigued and confused by her ability to carry herself as two different women. As a child, I studied her every move, absorbing her mannerisms like a sponge while learning how to express myself and assess safe and unsafe environments around me. Growing up, I didn't ask her many questions, not until I was sure I could support her in the sadness I believed would accompany her answers. As I reflect, there's one night that remains vivid in my memory. Looking back now with clearer and more knowledgeable eyes, it would seem as though my mother was on the brink of a mental breakdown. Without warning, she knocked on my bedroom door and announced that we would be having a sleepover. Frazzled but silent, she walked into my room with a large fold-out bed in hand, found a place right next to my bed, and positioned herself in front of my nightlight to settle in. Initially, I was excited by the thought of some extra mommy and me time, but it quickly became apparent that something was different. Dried tears streaked her face. "Mom, why are you crying?" I asked. "Don't worry, baby. Mommy is okay," she responded. "But you're not okay. What's wrong?" I didn't realize it then, but in my naive cry for answers, I empowered her to find strength of her own, the strength to acknowledge her needs. Though it wasn't my intent, it would seem as though my words were the very thing my mother needed to choose herself over everything. So without warning, and not too many days after our emotional conversation, she packed up her belongings and left home, leaving me and my brother to live with our father, without her. This painful memory remains crystal clear in my reflections, as it left me grappling with the profound complexities of love, loss, and a broken home. It was a life-changing moment that reshaped the dynamics of our family and set me on a path towards self-comfort as I navigated my own sadness alone. On one hand, I learned the power of my inquiries. On the other, I learned of his consequences. Interestingly, it is around age 8 that children develop the social and emotional growth to consider other people's perspectives and intentions. And at age 7, I had to quickly process my mother's tears and the word divorce, which was defined to me in some child-friendly language that I can't recall. It was as if my mother's tears were contagious, leaving me with a constant stream of my own, tears that I couldn't quite control or process. For the first few years of her absence, I'd climb into bed and cry myself to sleep, all while trying to keep as quiet as possible, so neither my father nor my brother would hear me. I didn't want them to know that I was hurting. The separation of my parents marked the onset of my silence, choosing silent tears as a means of coping. I can't tell you if that technique was learned behavior, as I didn't see my father and brother openly express sorrow or suffering, but it was something I innately knew to practice. Silent tears, as both my mother and I often shed, refers to tears that are shed quietly and discreetly. These tears are typically a buildup of one's inner emotions and can be shed when someone is feeling sad, overwhelmed, or emotional. More importantly, they can be shed in either public or private without drawing attention to oneself. Silent tears are deeply ingrained in the complex history of Black Americans. For over 400 years, my ancestors have chosen resilience, stoicism, and internal strength to survive. As a child, I nearly mastered this act, often crying to myself underneath the covers at night and waking up with a smile, determined to convince the world that I was okay. For Black women, silent tears can bear a unique weight. As we navigate a world that has often dismissed or silenced our experiences, our tears stand as pillars of strength and bearers of hidden sorrows. The power of the Black woman's experience is rooted in resilience and often conceals the pain we carry. My parents were both raised by strong, single, yet stressed Black women whose sacrifices and endurance were the foundation of my family's narratives. Yet it's essential to recognize that behind their unyielding strength lies a complexity of emotions shaped by the unspoken struggles they faced. That pivotal moment when my mom left signified the beginning of my emotional journey and an exploration of coping strategies often rooted in isolation. Since I didn't see my brother or father get emotional, I imagine they were probably doing the same. My brother's bedroom door was always closed, and my father was always busy fixing something or building in the backyard. When we did finally interact in our common living spaces, I could feel their sadness underneath the layer of disguise. All of us were heartbroken, but I never really knew if they were processing their emotions or simply distracting themselves to keep it together. About 4 years after my parents separated, my father's girlfriend Yolanda moved in and ultimately became my stepmom. There was something mysterious about Yolanda. Not that she was secretive, but she rarely shared unless I asked. I was curious and eager to connect with her, so my questions for her were never ending. And for some reason, whenever she told stories, I always asked, "Did they cry?" With an arched eyebrow and a hint of criticism, she always say, "You love when people cry." While I'm still unpacking this in therapy, I know my love for tears had to do with my desire to see people beneath the surface. It didn't matter if the tears were on the television from a complete stranger or from Yolanda. There was just something about people expressing their true emotions that pulled at my heartstrings. No matter where they stemmed from, I saw tears as an invitation to further my connections and relationships with those around me. After my mother left, I found myself hungry for vulnerability, and I often ate up the slightest bit of expressed emotion like it was my last meal. I found comfort in the familiarity of tears. In Beloved, one of my favorite books by Toni Morrison, she skillfully explores how both Black men and women navigate their memories and the ways in which they're often impacted by the lingering effects of slavery. Set shortly after the Civil War, one passage illustrates the unspoken pain that my people carry even today. Morrison writes, "Saying more might push them both to a place they couldn't get back from. He would keep the rest where it belonged, and that tobacco tin buried in his chest where a red heart used to be. Its lid rusted shut." Here, the characters opt to internalize their trauma to shield themselves from the things they wish not to face. Morrison's intimate exploration provided the means for people to understand how wishing the pain away with silence was a strategy that saved people, my people, from the fear of change. Generation after generation, this action in turn numbed the people around me. Although I wished for many years that my mother had never left, as I reflect through more mature eyes, I realize that it was best for everyone. My love for my mother manifests itself in the way I continue to encourage her to protect her fragility. My desire is to see her heal and find an escape from the fight or flight energies she exuded almost daily, behaviors that likely shaped me into the person I am today. With my mom, I am always advising. And that's just the role I took on, I guess, since I was age 7. With this in mind, I approach each day with a balance of open-mindedness, mental stamina, and strategy. That is what it has taken for me to have tough conversations with loved ones. While every conversation hasn't led to revelations, my familial relationships have become much easier to navigate. Still, working towards initiating these conversations can feel like an uphill battle. Suffering and silence. Suffering and silence is so deeply woven into Black American culture that even today, we continue to sing about silent tears with pride. Our pain, our suffering, and our struggles are both documented and used in inspiration in our work. Lift Every Voice and Sing, also known as the Black National Anthem, was created in 1900 as a hymn to celebrate African American resilience and progress, and to serve as a symbol of unity and hope during a time of racial segregation and discrimination in the United States. The poem turned song became an anthem for the continued civil rights movement, and it stands as an important expression of pride, perseverance, and unity within the Black community. In this song, you can feel our reality. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, Thou who has brought us thus far on the way, Thou who has by Thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path, we pray. If you look closer at your fellow humans and listen more intently to what they say, you'll notice that people all around us are suffering and experiencing increased instances of mental distress. However, suffering without words causes people to miss out on the chance for interventions and solutions for very serious issues like abuse, domestic violence, addiction, or other adversities. Holding our suffering inside of us keeps us from healing, and that is why we all must share more. How well can you articulate the impact of both your personal suffering and triumphs? How familiar are your loved ones with the person you've become and the art you've created, even if a mess, with your life as a result of your experiences? Despite frequent interactions, it's not uncommon to feel a sense of estrangement, even in familiar company. I once went to a At Your Service retreat in Amelia, New York, with a clothing brand and 50-plus strangers. On the first night, we did a reflective journaling prompt titled, "If You Really Knew Me, You'd Know." We kept the responses anonymous, but the host read the entries aloud, so that we could recognize just how much we relate to one another. It gave everyone permission to go as deep as they wanted, and we all leaned into the responsibility of safeguarding those truths, even if it meant processing unwanted revelations about ourselves. The prompt and experience opened up the door for us to choose to be familiar with one another, not only in that space, but in the days to come. I remember thinking, if I can do this in a room full of strangers, how come I can't do this at home? In 2012, my mother and I founded the Precious Dreams Foundation. To date, we've supported over 25,000 young people with direct mental health and support services to aid in their transition both in and out of state care. It's always a challenge to convince each child that we are well-intentioned and trauma-informed certified professionals who genuinely care and want to see them succeed. We often encounter youth who, out of protective instinct, guard their pain and insecurities, fearing that revealing them will arm others with the means to exploit them further. It requires time and patience to help them understand that some people care, and we are sent like messengers to do the work of God. To support ourselves, our community, and our loved ones, we must spark meaningful conversations and lean in. We must give ourselves permission to be vulnerable and reveal our truths to heal the fractures in our full body, mind, and spirit, and set ourselves and our families free. We must practice telling people how we're truly doing and requesting space to share with those who give us comfort. Having little to no social support is a predominant risk factor for developed thoughts of self-harm, especially amongst young people. No one should navigate these types of experiences alone, but we must be willing to honor our needs before we can understand how others can properly support us. Generational silence's effect on mental well-being. Most people navigate the world holding their words within them, often with the belief that they're taking the easier route. What they fail to realize is that unexpressed emotions and suppressed thoughts can physically manifest into our bodies and compromise our well-being over time. This is why learning emotional regulation skills and preventing emotional avoidance is so important. Remaining silent about issues that impact us and our families has pushed many individuals to the brink of mental distress, which is a leading cause of mental health disorders like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and dissociative disorders. Think back to a time when you remained silent about an injustice or issue that directly affected you. Did you experience any of the following signs? Exaggerated responses to small issues, a lump or choking sensation in the throat, dissociative mental states, muscle tension or tightness, joint or body pains with no apparent known cause, addiction to drugs, alcohol, or other harmful behaviors, an inability to cry. The human body is remarkable and has the ability to persevere through many of life's challenges, but this resilience doesn't come without consequence. We all harbor unresolved emotions to a varying degree, but in using self-acceptance and self-compassion as our guide, we can begin to navigate both negative and positive emotions, no matter how uncomfortable they make us feel, knowing that it is in our discomfort that our life forms more meaning. Our ability to process our emotional responses to any given situation is an essential skill that we're not often taught or shown how to embrace at home. It's also worth mentioning that this skill is one that comes easier for some than others. If you're atypically brained, like my mother, it can take more effort to process emotions. Being atypical usually refers to individuals who are highly sensitive, creative, or neurodivergent, such as those with ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, dyslexia, and other non-neurotypical conditions. According to clinical psychologist Joel Nigg, neurodivergent people can experience challenges with emotional dysregulation, which causes them to experience greater difficulty when responding to the intensity of their emotional responses. When this is the case, it might feel easier to suppress or improperly process those emotions. Thought stopping, which is the process of trying to block out negative or unwanted thoughts, and emotional suppression, which is the conscious or subconscious act of withholding one's feelings, are two common coping strategies that typically cause individuals to inadvertently relive traumatic experiences or suffer from the effects of suppressed emotions. Both strategies can be helpful in the short term, but eventually the negative thoughts return and can be accompanied by impaired emotional intelligence, reduced emotional awareness, and exacerbated mental disorders. My grandfather is a prime example of someone who suppressed his emotions and completely blocked out the truth of a story in order to cope. As a child, being forced into a mental institution with adults, I am positive he experienced traumas that haunted him more than likely to this day. But to cope, he suppressed these memories. In the end, it left him without the opportunity to seek and receive the support he truly needed. I'm sure many of us know someone who has experienced negative outcomes due to their perceived belief that they are better off in silence. However, the reality is their actions, or lack thereof, have the ability to cause greater harm and disconnection, possibly impacting their personal relationships and professional performance. If you are navigating life with eyes wide open, it's easy to see the impact of slavery on communities of color. The emotional and psychological burden that Black people knowingly or unknowingly carry, although lighter than the load of our ancestors, still remains substantial today. Years of inequality and discrimination lead me to question how we got here to a silent and peaceful state, not seeking revenge, but hoping for justice and hiding our pain. As I tend to the scars left by those before me, I maintain a sense of responsibility for my family and the children in my community. In the words of Maya Angelou, the truth is, none of us can be free until we're all free. So I ask you this: what significant historical traumas or events have your ancestors experienced? A 2023 study published in Brain and Behavior Journal discovered that descendants of Holocaust survivors had shown stress and hormonal changes, indicating a shift in their genetic makeup, which implies that stressful events experienced by parents and grandparents can affect children even before they are born. Even after the threat has passed and the people have resettled, the body does not return to an unstressed state. And this response can cause physical and psychological problems for future generations. Similarly, Indigenous populations in the United States and Australia still struggle to cope with colonization, cultural erasure, and the violence committed against their communities, mainly because the historical injustices and systemic inequalities aren't being fully addressed, both within the community and outside of it. Violence causes trauma, and wars against entire communities can redefine the lives of generations. Even in modern times, we often find ourselves watching helplessly as power struggles and exploitation lead to conflict around the world. Watching innocent people die, whether in our own families or communities, online or on television, impacts all of us. These memories imprint themselves indelibly in our mind and body and wreak havoc on our sense of self and safety. The only way to truly heal this is to talk. So, how do you encourage family members to share their stories and talk about their emotions, especially those who have gone their whole lives without doing so? Speaking on trauma. On September 11th, 2001, my mother was working in her Manhattan office on Water Street when she was alerted of the first plane hitting the Twin Towers. Fearing that the U.S. was under attack, everyone in tall buildings in the immediate vicinity moved quickly to evacuate and get outdoors. In full panic mode, my mother swiftly walked toward the towers, wanting to witness the unbelievable with her own eyes. What she saw next left her forever changed. Standing there, eyes fixated on the sky, the second plane made impact with the South Tower of the World Trade Center. As she finally turned to run, reality began to settle in. She had just witnessed a terrorist attack. Coming from Harlem, my mother constantly witnessed violence growing up, but none of those traumatic situations compared to what she saw in the few minutes she spent evacuating her office that day. As tragedy erupted all around her, my mother, without any GPS or navigation instructions, found herself running alongside waves of people, their feet pounding the asphalt toward the Brooklyn Bridge. She recalls the bridge being so packed that it swayed from left to right, and the fear set in that she might not make it home. My mother vividly recalls the lasting emotional impact of witnessing people leap from the Twin Towers in a last effort to save themselves. September 11th, the day she marks as the worst day of her life. changed the lives of many. But my mother, although privileged to be alive, was left with a version of herself that my family and I struggled to recognize. After 9/11, my mother was diagnosed with anxiety. The fearless woman who had once navigated the world with ease now found herself gripped by panic attacks and nervous breakdowns whenever she attempted to board a plane or embark on a lengthy car ride. Growing up, there were plenty of moments when I questioned whether or not my family struggled with mental health issues, but I never had proof. My mother's diagnosis, although disappointing, was a moment that I believed would spark open conversations about mental health within our family. I was curious to learn more about my mother's brain and, by extension, maybe my own. However, to my surprise, even with a clinical diagnosis, my mother tried to hide her symptoms by keeping them to herself when she was triggered or struggled. Outside Angie didn't show vulnerability. Tough as nails, she couldn't afford to give anyone a front row seat to her anxiety. And in 2001, when I didn't live with my mother anymore, it became easier for her to hide the fragile pieces of herself from me entirely. Even if there was a desire to unpack what lay dormant deep inside, my family didn't have affordable and accessible mental health solutions, and emotional development in general wasn't a priority. A roof over our heads, food on the table, most nights, and clothes on our backs were all that we really needed. When you functioned for so long with a mentality to just get by, shifting your perspective from survival mode to growth and development isn't so easy. So it can be challenging for people to tap into their needs beyond those that are most vital. My mother was the only other person besides myself to receive a diagnosis of a mental disorder and share it amongst the family. Both of us receiving the news in our adult years. Between the two of us, we carry diagnosis of depression, ADHD, and anxiety. While I can say that unashamedly, I do often wonder where these conditions originated from. Although I know a traumatic event ignited my mother's anxiety, I also know that anxiety can lie dormant and remain largely unnoticed for decades until a triggered event or trauma brings it to the surface. Some individuals may have a predisposition to anxiety due to genetic or environmental factors, but may not experience noticeable symptoms until they're faced with similar trauma. This is often called latent or hidden anxiety. Seeing anxiety exhibited within my mother makes me understand the increase in undeniable symptoms that I display. When my husband is driving, I am a high alert and sometimes fearful passenger who is unable to trust that he can avoid every possible turn of danger. When I enter new spaces or experience new people, I often play with my hands, hoping to stay connected and distract myself from the social anxiety that's hell-bent on emerging. And more recently, I've learned that I suffer from chronic heart palpitations, which can also be a symptom of anxiety. Speaking to my mother about anxiety, both hers and mine, used to mean waiting for her to initiate the conversation. But now that I'm intentionally tackling generational silence, I take the initiative, ensuring that I approach her with compassion and empathy. To help her disarm, I often share information that I've seen or read that can speak to the symptoms I've recognized in myself, or I may tell her about new findings she might recognize in herself. I also inquire about how she's responding to her needs and whether or not she believes her coping techniques work. This is my subtle way of offering support without actually saying, "I am here to help," a well-meaning phrase that might trigger her to shut down. Breaking the mental health stigma in your family. We all know someone who can admit to needing therapy but hasn't taken the steps to make it happen. Whether they tend to get in their own way or they allow the opinions or discriminatory attitudes of others to overshadow their needs, people often find a way to make excuses or avoid getting help. Mindsets like, therapy is too expensive. My therapist is my best friend. I know what I'm doing. I can deal with it myself. Or even a general fear of judgment or aversion to authority are not reasons to diminish your potential and forego professional help and thoroughly tested support services. This barrier, which some allow to be a roadblock, can decrease one's confidence and negatively impact the likelihood that they will follow through on utilizing therapeutic interventions. Therapy is indeed expensive, but there are plenty of resources for free or discounted therapy online. I recently received free therapy through Taraji P. Henson's organization, the Boris Lawrence Henson Foundation, after searching for sponsored therapy programs and filling out a 10-minute online application. Some states, like New Jersey and California, offer partnerships that provide free counseling to students. And there are many nonprofits that exist solely to give communities access to mental health services. Investing time in research can help you discover programs you weren't aware of. If you want help, you can find it, despite the difficulties in obtaining it. When people approach a roadblock, there are a few ways they're likely to respond. Some simply turn around and return to their starting point, believing that the trip was not meant to be taken. Some will look for another option or route, even if it extends the trip. And then others will still try to push through before looking for alternate options as a backup. Life always gives us options, even with stigmas involved. To break any type of stigma and overcome roadblocks, you must evaluate how you are approaching each situation and whether or not you are truly determined to do what's best for you, despite the difficulty. In many communities, seeking mental health care has been perceived as a sign of weakness rather than the courageous act that it truly is. Families can fear the embarrassment or shame in admitting that there are cracks within the foundation. Particularly in Black communities, there's a deep-rooted survivalist attitude that we have everything we need. Historically, this mentality is birthed from the idea that we've endured so much and overcome without outside support, and we will be all right, despite what life may bring. But acknowledging what's been done and seeing ourselves as capable of becoming better allows us to find strength in growing, and it gives us permission to do and be better. You have the ability to empower your family to face their mental health support roadblocks. In everyday conversation, you can share healing techniques, which I'll soon list, with your loved ones and ask if they are familiar with them and if they've considered trying them. These approaches, whether mentioned to explore the possibility of treatment or simply as talking points, can be valuable tools for introducing the idea of alternative approaches and promoting mental and emotional well-being in our loved ones. Some of these techniques include meditation, regular exercise, and eating healing foods, talk or sound therapy, support groups, grounding, art and creative workshops, acupuncture, and breathwork. For additional guidance on how we can approach the topic of mental health with our families, I sat down with psychiatrist and self-care coach Dr. Janet Taylor. This is what she shared. To break down the barriers and reduce the stigma around issues of mental health, it's critical that individuals and their families get support and education. Mental illness is a brain-based biologic disease, not a weakness or curse, and it's treatable. When folks understand the why, it can lessen fear, judgment, and stigma. For someone newly diagnosed, Mental illness can be confusing and generate a range of emotions. Speaking truthfully with trusted friends and family can be a wonderful resource and allow for connection and not feeling alone and isolated. NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, can provide a wealth of information for families and has local chapters for support and resources. No matter how you slice it, it all comes back to communication. Conversation is an invaluable tool to help break the mental health stigma and get ourselves and our families the help and healthcare we deserve. For me in particular, having these necessary conversations literally saved my life. In 2022, my mental health declined drastically due to unexpected health concerns. With sadness coming in frequent waves, threatening to drown me with every breath I took, I leaned on talk therapy to help me stay above water. I explained to my therapist that I didn't know how to cope anymore. I didn't want to journal or exercise, and I rebelled against every health approach I'd previously taken, feeling as if doing nothing and being completely inactive was just easier. Even though my career was built on teaching coping mechanisms to children around the world, when I was faced with difficult times, I couldn't listen to my own advice. It was a sudden and disheartening twist to go from helping others to being unable to help myself. Throughout our sessions, my therapist gave me specific writing prompts and assignments that I had to complete before sessions, and she held me accountable to my desire to feel better. Excuses aren't accepted in therapy. Instead, you are consistently tasked with looking at yourself in the metaphorical mirror for the 30 minutes or hour that you meet with your therapist. While it can feel uncomfortable, I try to think of it like going to the gym. I don't necessarily enjoy the circuits, but I will be grateful for the results in the end. One assignment from therapy that stuck with me was the request to find a childhood photo and visualize myself as that child. My therapist suggested I write out what drew me to that age, what hurt me at that age, and what my child self wanted that she didn't get, and what feelings she had at that time. Doing this initially felt easy, as I picked one of my favorite photos. But as I went through the questions, I realized I had only been focusing on the moment that the image was captured and not the time frame it was taken in. I felt extremely uncomfortable examining that particular time of my life. Yet processing the journey from that point to adulthood showed me that I had the power to be better for that young girl. I was no longer a powerless child, and I had to start acting like it. Questions to ask yourself. Prior to engaging with others about these topics, it's important to prioritize time for self-reflection. Before taking my thoughts to others, I do my best to process them thoroughly and get clear on where I stand. Processing looks different for all of us, but I have found that introspection and self-inquiry often lead to beautiful discoveries, allowing us to form clearer judgments without being easily influenced by others' opinions. So, throughout this audiobook, I'll pose a series of questions that are meant to spark or challenge your self-awareness. It's your choice how you answer them. You can write your responses, or they can live in your mind. Wherever you decide to place them, just make sure you allow yourself to sit with the truth. If you choose to write out your answers, I suggest also writing the question and the date, so you can return to your answers with a full understanding of where you were at that moment of reflection. The first question: to what extent can I describe how my brain functions? Just as our fingerprints are unique, so are our brains. Because no two individuals are hardwired the same, we must use our understanding of our specific anatomy to advocate for our mental needs and well-being. The brain, being your control center and the most complex organ in the body, needs love to function, and simple things such as bodily hydration and rest to support your mental health. The brain is made up of over 70% water, so if the body is even 2% dehydrated, it can impair your ability to perform basic tasks that require attention, psychomotor, and immediate memory skills. Are you aware of the micro decisions you make each day that positively or negatively impact your brain? For me, knowing more about how my brain operates, especially with ADHD, has helped me figure out ways to focus better and complete tasks in which I have little interest. My understanding of myself has helped me to explain to others why I sometimes get distracted and how they can better provide support for me to operate at my best. It's bridged many gaps in my personal relationships, dispelling myths and breaking stigmas. At work, my colleagues know that I prefer minimal interference in conversation so I can stay on task. And they know that if I'm not taking notes in a meeting, I will absolutely forget what next steps are required. Similarly, my friends have learned not to confuse my distracted nature with a lack of empathy or care. My mother is continuously learning how her brain operates by examining how her anxiety functions and doing the work of uncovering techniques that help quell it. Today, she is 3 years free of anxiety medication. While challenges persist, the side effects were more than she could bear. So instead, she leaned heavily on establishing a holistic self-care journey. She completely changed her diet and began stretching to relieve her stress in her 30s, meditating in her late 40s, and practicing yoga in her 50s. She credits all of these practices for her ability to manage her thoughts after she gained a better understanding of her needs. She also focuses on the acronym FEAR, FEAR, fake evidence appearing real, which helps her understand what's really happening in her mind when fear tries to take over. The acronym reminds her to detach from the ideals that may be holding her back, those that aren't even part of reality. If my mother can overcome that in her 50s, anyone else can do the same at any time. The second question: do I find myself self-medicating to cope? In the 1980s, when antidepressants hit the market, alcohol use declined. This statistic reveals the truth that many people had been using alcohol to cope with symptoms of depression, but it also highlights the reality that self-medicating has the ability to make mental health issues worse. Drugs, including alcohol, provide very temporary relief, tricking people into thinking that they have control as long as they have access to the thing that gives them a high or relief. But in reality, their issues are taking a temporary backseat. And many times, when those negative thoughts or feelings return, they hit even harder than before, leading to yet another round of self-medication. I grew up observing how people struggle with drug and alcohol abuse, watching as my family members fell more and more dependent on the drugs each day to maintain some semblance of sanity. It's painful to watch, and even more painful to feel like drugs are your only option for peace of mind. When someone decides to stop drinking alcohol, they often face questions like, "What's wrong?" Or, "Is everything okay?" When in reality, the questioning should happen in reverse, asking those who indulge in chemical components that impair cognitive and motor functions if they are indeed in need of support. The harmful use of substances has multiple direct effects on adolescents and adults alike. The likelihood of unemployment, physical health problems, dysfunctional social relationships, suicidal tendencies, mental illness, and lower life expectancy is increased with substance use, even more so in adolescence. In the most serious cases, harmful use of drugs can lead to a cycle in which one's damaged socioeconomic standing and inability to develop relationships ends up feeding the substance use even further. Self-medicating to cope is an easy trap to fall into, and because of the negative stigma that's associated with it, people are often hesitant to acknowledge their truths. And since self-medicating tends to become a normal part of everyday life, it can be hard to recognize when it's happening. Here are a few signs that you or someone you know may be self-medicating to cope with life. And I've included some questions you or they can consider for each one. Number 1. Turning to alcohol or drugs when you're feeling anxious, depressed, or overwhelmed. The question that you could consider asking: am I running from my problems today? Number 2. If you're feeling the need for something stronger to feel relief over time. If it used to take 1 glass of wine to feel relief, but now it takes 3 or 4 glasses, you may be building an unhealthy dependence and/or addiction. A question to consider: am I drinking or using drugs so it can numb my emotions or thoughts? Number 3. Isolating from others and developing a preference to drink or use drugs alone. Question to consider: by isolating, am I trying to prevent people from seeing my struggles or dependence? If so, why? Number 4. The idea of not having drugs or alcohol is stressful. If you find yourself avoiding social settings or situations where substances won't be available, you may be becoming reliant upon those substances. A question that you should consider: is this social setting a place where I can find enjoyment, even if drugs and alcohol aren't present? Number 5. Loved ones express concerns about your substance use. Question to consider: is there some truth to their concerns? Number 6. Your school and/or work performance is negatively impacted and you find yourself making excuses for incomplete tasks or missing work altogether. A question to consider: how could losing my scholarship or source of income impact my life and the lives of those around me? If any of these signs of self-medication feel relatable to you and/or you are not content with your responses, I encourage you to seek professional support without delay or reach out to a loved one for help. Become okay with admitting your shortcomings so you can receive the support you need and deserve. This level of introspection is not about judging yourself harshly. Rather, it's about loving yourself so much that the idea of numbing your pain begins to feel like self-harm and a turnoff. Instead, opt for real, long-lasting relief, which a certified coach, therapist, or substance abuse treatment center can provide. The third question: what barriers prevent me from speaking to my family about mental health? Facing your mental health challenges head-on requires that you acknowledge your need for support in order to take back your life. It is not a sign of weakness to ask for help. In fact, it takes courage and bravery to step outside of your comfort zone in pursuit of a clearer heart and mind. Dr. Taylor shared with me in conversation: if you have tried to talk about your mental health, first, congratulate yourself on the effort. Resistance from family members may come from their own denial or guilt and should not stop you from engaging in conversation. You can offer to talk to them at any time, but the real focus has to be on your mental well-being. Family involvement should not be an additional stressor. Let them know how you are feeling, where you are getting care, and what medication you are taking. Modeling a positive attitude in your own self-efficacy is empowering. And that is what I call self-love. Sometimes the tools to prepare for talks about mental health are best acquired from professionals or a loved one who possesses a deep understanding of the individual in question. Recognizing any barriers and potential facilitators for the conversation can be pivotal in paving the foundation for an open dialogue. For many, shame, guilt, or the fear of judgment or rejection can act as forceful deterrents, discouraging them from even seeking help. This is why it's essential to be empathetic and open-minded. Understand that everyone comes to these conversations with their own baggage, perspective, and awareness of self. Strive to identify such barriers in your loved ones and tailor your interactions accordingly. One way to do this is to spark the conversation by leading with your own vulnerability. This creates a safe environment and allows the other party to feel more comfortable opening up as well. Perhaps if I had talked to my grandfather about my learning challenges and ADHD, he may have felt compelled to share his struggles in school. Or maybe not. I wouldn't know unless I tried. It's also important to navigate these conversations with the understanding that people will only meet you as far as they are willing to go. If the person isn't familiar with what you are sharing, they are more likely to respond from a place of ignorance. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but it could mean they need a little more education before you can engage in a meaningful conversation with them. So here's the chapter's healer's recap. As we close out this chapter, I want to leave you with a few key concepts to keep in mind. In the subsequent chapters, we will build on this knowledge to get to a place where we feel confident enough to break generational silence once and for all. Ask your parents questions about your grandparents' mental health. If this is not an option for you, look into getting your adoption records unsealed or speak with people who knew your family personally. We all harbor unresolved emotions in our bodies. It's important we address them so they don't manifest in our behaviors. Evaluate your relationship with tears. What do you feel, and what have you been taught about crying? Time does not heal all wounds. Sometimes the wounds that are left unhealed are passed to the next generation. The long-term negative impacts of thought stopping and emotional suppression outweigh the temporary satisfaction of distracting yourself from the experience. Recognize when fear is fake evidence appearing real. Then try to reframe your thoughts based on what's actually real. Learn, love, and invest in your brain to improve your mental well-being. And finally, resistance from family members may come from their own denial or guilt and should not stop you from engaging in conversation.